In this episode, we tackle a situation that is extremely common in real compliance work, even in well-run organizations. Sometimes you cannot implement a baseline control exactly as written, at least not right now, and you still have to manage risk and meet compliance expectations. This is where compensating and alternate controls come in. A compensating control is an added safeguard that reduces risk when a required control cannot be implemented fully, and an alternate control is a different method of achieving the same intent of the requirement through a different approach that fits the system context. The danger is that people sometimes treat these ideas as a permission slip to do less, when the reality is the opposite. To use compensating and alternate controls correctly, you must understand the intent of the original control, the specific gap created by not implementing it as written, and how your chosen compensating or alternate approach actually preserves that intent in a way that can be tested and defended. The goal here is to help you implement these controls without breaking compliance intent, without creating hidden weaknesses, and without writing documentation that collapses under assessment questions. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at CGRC.Me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. Start with a clear mental separation between a control requirement and a particular implementation pattern. Framework controls are usually written to describe outcomes and behaviors, not to mandate a single technology, because frameworks must apply across many environments. Even so, controls sometimes imply certain capabilities that a system may not have, such as strong authentication features in a legacy component or detailed logging capabilities in an older platform. When you cannot meet the control as written, your first task is to identify exactly what part of the requirement you cannot satisfy and why. Vague statements like the system does not support it are not enough because they do not tell you which protection outcome is missing. A defensible approach names the missing capability, such as inability to enforce a certain authentication step, inability to generate a required type of audit record, or inability to apply a required configuration setting. Then you explain the reason, such as technical limitations, operational constraints, or external dependencies. This clarity matters because compensating and alternate controls must be designed to cover the specific gap, not to provide generic extra security. Next, define compliance intent in a way that guides your decisions rather than confusing them. Intent is the reason the control exists, the risk it is addressing, and the outcome it expects. For example, an access control requirement often exists to prevent unauthorized access and to reduce access creep over time. A logging requirement often exists to detect misuse and to support investigation and accountability. A configuration management requirement often exists to prevent drift and unauthorized changes. An availability-related requirement often exists to ensure mission continuity and to reduce the impact of disruptions. When you understand intent, you can evaluate whether an alternate approach truly achieves the same outcome. If you do not understand intent, you might choose a control that sounds related but does not actually address the risk. Intent is also what an assessor will probe, because they will ask how your compensating measure achieves the control objective, not whether you tried your best. So intent is not a philosophical concept. It is the central standard you must preserve. Now let's talk about alternate controls, because alternate is often the cleaner option when a different approach can still meet the same intent. An alternate control is not a weaker version. It is a different method that still satisfies the requirement's purpose. For example, if a control expects strong authentication for certain access, an alternate might be using a centralized identity service that provides equivalent assurance when a local component cannot enforce it directly. If a control expects audit logging at a certain level, an alternate might involve logging at a different layer, such as capturing events at the gateway or intermediary service, as long as the captured events still allow detection and accountability for relevant actions. If a control expects a certain configuration enforcement method that is not supported, an alternate might be using a managed baseline at the platform layer that achieves the same hardened state. The key test is whether the alternate preserves the control outcome for the system scope, not whether it resembles the original method. Alternate controls require careful mapping to evidence, because you must show that the alternate actually provides the necessary assurance, not just that it exists. Compensating controls are often used when you cannot achieve the same outcome directly and need to reduce risk by layering other protections. A compensating control might include additional monitoring, tighter access restrictions, more frequent reviews, stronger segmentation, or stricter change approvals, depending on what gap exists. For example, if a legacy component cannot support a strong authentication step, a compensation might involve restricting access to that component to a smaller set of users, adding additional monitoring for those users' actions, and increasing review frequency of access assignments. If a system cannot produce detailed audit records, a compensation might involve capturing traffic logs and administrative action records from adjacent components, plus implementing tighter change controls and periodic reconciliation of critical records. If a system cannot meet a desired vulnerability remediation timeline due to vendor constraints, a compensation might involve temporary exposure reduction, increased monitoring, and a documented exception with a review schedule. The key is that compensating controls are designed to reduce risk exposure in the presence of a known weakness, and they should be described as a deliberate plan, not as a casual workaround. A beginner misunderstanding is thinking compensating controls are purely technical, like adding another security feature, but compensation often requires process changes as well. If a weakness increases the risk of unauthorized changes, a process compensation might include stricter approvals, separation of duties for sensitive actions, and more frequent review of change records. If a weakness increases the risk of data exposure, a process compensation might include tighter data handling restrictions, reduced data availability in the component, and additional oversight for exports. These process compensations matter because they address the human pathways that create risk when technical enforcement is limited. They also generate evidence that can support compliance, such as approval records and review logs, which can be critical when technical evidence is incomplete. A strong compensating plan typically combines technical and operational safeguards because layered protection is more credible than relying on a single substitute. The goal is to make it harder for the weakness to be exploited and easier to detect if something goes wrong. To implement compensating and alternate controls without breaking intent, you need to avoid two opposite mistakes: weakening the requirement through language and overbuilding a pile of controls with no clear purpose. The weakening mistake happens when people rewrite the control description into vague promises like "we strive to," "we attempt to," or "we follow best practices." That language does not preserve intent because it does not describe enforceable behavior. The overbuilding mistake happens when people add many unrelated controls to sound thorough, but they do not actually cover the specific gap, and they create operational burden that cannot be maintained. The disciplined approach is to keep the gap specific and the response targeted. You state what cannot be done, what risk that creates relative to the original intent, what alternate or compensating measures are implemented, and why those measures reduce the risk to an acceptable level. Then you define how that will be tested, such as what evidence will show the measures are operating and how often they are reviewed. This keeps the response coherent and defensible. Evidence is especially important for compensating and alternate controls because assessors will naturally be skeptical when a baseline requirement is not met as written. A strong documentation approach shows that you did not simply choose convenience. You followed a structured decision process. You identify the original requirement, the reason it cannot be met fully, the chosen alternate or compensating approach, and how the approach preserves the outcome. You also document ownership, because compensation often requires ongoing activities such as increased monitoring or more frequent review, and without ownership, those activities will fade. You include review and expiration logic, because many compensating measures are not intended to last forever. For example, if the constraint is a legacy limitation, your plan might include a future system upgrade path, and until then, the compensation remains in place with periodic reassessment. This makes the compliance story stable because it shows continuous governance rather than a one-time exception. In assessments, a well-managed exception with credible mitigation is often more acceptable than a vague claim of compliance. Another key skill is making sure compensating and alternate controls do not create contradictions with other requirements or introduce new risks that are not addressed. For example, if you compensate for weak authentication by restricting access to a smaller group, you must ensure that group is managed tightly and that privileged access is monitored. Otherwise, you have simply concentrated risk. If you compensate for missing logs by increasing administrative oversight, you must ensure oversight records are accurate and protected, or you might create a false record. If you implement an alternate logging approach at a gateway, you must ensure it captures enough context to support accountability and incident response, and that the gateway logs are protected and retained appropriately. Compensations and alternates can also affect privacy and data handling requirements if they change where data is stored or how it is monitored, so your design should ensure those obligations remain met. The point is not to avoid compensation because it is complex. The point is to consider second-order effects so your fix does not create a new gap elsewhere. A disciplined approach treats compensations as part of the system's overall control design, not as isolated patches. It is also crucial to maintain the baseline's consistency, even when alternate and compensating controls are used, because inconsistency can create uneven protection across the system. If one component uses standard controls and another uses compensating measures, you should document the difference clearly and ensure the overall risk remains acceptable. You should also ensure that operational processes still work, such as incident response and monitoring, because inconsistent logging sources or inconsistent access paths can slow investigations and confuse responders. If compensations require special handling, such as additional reviews or restricted workflows, that special handling must be trained and operationalized, or people will accidentally bypass it. This ties directly into continued compliance strategy, because compensating measures often require more ongoing attention than standard controls. A compensation that is not maintained becomes a fragile promise, and fragility is the opposite of compliance intent. So implementing compensation is not just adding a safeguard. It is committing to operating it consistently. By the end of this lesson, the main outcome is that you can implement compensating and alternate controls in a way that preserves compliance intent and produces a defensible, testable control story. You start by identifying the specific portion of a requirement that cannot be met and the gap that creates relative to the control's intent, rather than hiding behind vague constraints. You choose alternates when a different method can still achieve the same outcome, and you choose compensations when you must reduce risk through layered safeguards that address the weakness directly. You document the decision with clear rationale, ownership, evidence expectations, and review cadence, because compensation is only credible when it is operated and verified over time. You also check for second-order effects so your alternate or compensation does not create new gaps in monitoring, governance, or data handling. When you can do this well, you show what mature compliance really looks like, not pretending constraints do not exist, but managing them transparently and responsibly while still honoring the framework's purpose.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit BareMetalCyber.com.